Chi, did you want to share a little bit?
Yeah, I just wanted to say hi and welcome to all of you. It's so lovely to see you all again. And I think we'll have some very educational hours to look forward to. But before we get started, a short message to our coming YouTube listeners. This Q&A is dedicated to the MBT volunteer community. And the work that we do is all about spreading the message about the MBT model in various ways. So we run quite a few creative projects currently. And if you want to know more about our community, please send an email to mbtvolunteers@gmail.com. So, Vanessa, now I'm curious, who will do the first question?
Yeah, looks like Frank has a question. So thank you, Titi. Frank has a question about AI and consciousness. So Frank, you're up.
Okay, yeah, I was just trying to clarify what I understand about artificial intelligence and consciousness. I know Tom has, I've heard him say a couple times in the past, if we build a sufficiently complex AI, that will be, occupied by consciousness. And I just want to make sure I'm understanding, because I think what he's saying is that consciousness will find that something it can use to grow and it will occupy it. But no matter what artificial intelligence we create, we're not creating new consciousness, are we? It's just that we are creating something potentially that consciousness may want to occupy, if I'm understanding that correctly. I'm just trying to understand what's going on there.
That is correct, Frank. You are exactly right. You can't create consciousness, you can't program consciousness, but you can create a platform that consciousness would find it valuable to log on to. And that platform is what we call an avatar. So you can create an avatar, and whether that avatar is done in carbon-based, like, humans, or carbon-based or silicon-based, like computers, it really doesn't matter, as long as it has the qualities that consciousness is looking for in order to help it evolve, which means it'd have to have interesting choices with serious consequences, with real consequences. Moral choices, ethical choices are kind of the best. If all the computer's going to do is say, play a game of chess, we have computers that are very good at that, and maybe even computers that have free will, in the sense that they're not programmed to just look things up as to what the best next move would be, going through all the chess games that have ever been played and so on. It's not a brute force method, but the better ones now are done with neural nets. And the neural net is basically just given the rules for chess and told to go learn. And then it plays a lot of practice games and learns, and eventually it's so good that it can beat the big brute force computers like Deep Blue. So it's never actually given any information about chess other than the rules. So in that case, I would say that entity has free will, in the sense that no one has any idea why it makes the choices that it does, because it adjusts its own software as it goes. So it's kind of meets the criteria, half the criteria for consciousness. Consciousness has two criteria: one, awareness, and two, free will. Has choices, so it's consciousness with a choice. But I think it's called AlphaZero is the name of the software that is the best chess player right now. So AlphaZero is a neural net, probably qualifies for free will, in that it makes its choices in an unknown way. It's not just an if-then kind of programming. It is shrouded with enough uncertainty that nobody understands exactly why or how it makes the choices it does. It's just part of its learning. But it fails, the AlphaZero fails as far as awareness goes. It's just a machine that does what it does. It's not really aware of what it's doing or why it's doing it. And if we gave it something, if we gave that that entity something more to do than just play chess, then perhaps consciousness would take it on as an avatar. But I don't see consciousness wanting to take on something that just plays chess. There's not a lot of growth potential there. So you see, we're getting close as far as abilities to create a conscious computer. We have half of it, and the other half is really more of just the applications we give it to do. So that's why I think that it's not going to be, too far in the future that we will see a conscious computer. Now, a conscious computer is not going to be the same as a conscious human. Consciousness doesn't just come in one type, and that's human. Consciousness comes in all sorts of variations in capacity and ability. Bumblebees and frogs and dogs and cats, all are conscious, but to differing degrees, smaller and larger decision spaces there. So a conscious computer will be conscious in a way that humans are not, just like dogs are conscious in a way that humans are not. It'll be different. It won't be human-like consciousness unless that consciousness has human-like choices to make. So, the consciousness is kind of what that consciousness is like, its attributes or its personality has to do with what it does, what it's asked to understand, what the choices that it's asked to make. So if it's put in charge of, say, the electrical grid in the United States, to where its job is to balance all the power requirements across a national power grid, then that would have some ethical choices. Power goes out, who gets it back first? Hospitals, old people, there's things that it would have to think about and make decisions on based on all of the data that it had at the time. So maybe that would begin to qualify as a conscious computer. But if that's all that it did, you can see it would be a very narrow consciousness. It wouldn't have the breadth and depth that, say, a human does, because the human has so much decision space, so much things it has the potential to do or not do.
Would there be a way of knowing if consciousness had decided to occupy a machine like that? Would there be a way of telling that was happening?
Well, the only way to tell it is sort of like the Turing test, and that is, if you couldn't tell the difference between that and the human, if it made choices and made them well, then you would know that if it was making those choices out of free will, you wouldn't be able to guess what its choice would be. It would be unique in its choosing. And just like all of us, nobody can tell exactly what we're going to do next because we have free will. So it would exhibit that, and it would exhibit an understanding of itself. It would have self-awareness. It would know itself as what it was. So if we gave it language, then we could tell probably in conversation whether it was doing unique things and figuring things out on its own, or whether it was just following some kind of learned process. Okay. But it wouldn't be easy. It's not an easy way. It's not an easy thing to tell. We can have expert systems that are not conscious. They're just a lot of if-then statements, a lot of balancing, probability, and lots of databases, and they can appear to be conscious. They could speak, they can answer questions, they can interact with you in ways that they would appear to be conscious. And as expert systems get better, which basically means as computers get faster and faster to where they can crunch huge amounts of data very quickly, more so than they do now, then expert systems could approach human behavior, but it would not be conscious at all. It would just be a very fast computer, not really aware of itself, just doing what it was programmed to do.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. And next up we have Emad.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Tom, and thank you for taking your time. I have a question about MBT. I want to know where MBT comes from. I mean, what is the source for that? How did you understand MBT as it is today? I mean, what is the source? Is it quantum physics or is it meditation? How did you find it out?
Well, that's a good question. It was a long process, Emad. It took some, I don't know, 30, 35 years, in the making, coming together. The book itself took about 5 years to write. But it started, I guess, back in the early 70s when I was going out to the Monroe Laboratory and being the theorist of the group. We had Bob the businessman, Dennis the engineer, and Tom the physicist. So I was the theorist of the group, and I wanted to understand how it worked. Why did it work, and what could it do? And all those kind of questions were in my mind. I wanted to create a model that would represent consciousness. So I started working on it then. So where did it start? It started in the early 1970s when I started thinking about, what is this consciousness thing? And basically then I just needed to explore consciousness enough that I could come up with some consciousness facts, things that I knew about consciousness, the way consciousness was. And then once I had a good set of consciousness facts, which was not a quick thing to come up with, because that takes a lot of, for something to be a fact, it has to be repeatable. It has to be not just me, but other people have to have similar experiences. But it has to be a repeatable sort of thing. So you have to, hold all the variables but one variable constant, and then change that one variable and see how that affects the whole, in order to figure out what's driving what's the causality, because consciousness, of course, has its own causality. And over time, I had these set of consciousness facts. An example of a consciousness fact would be probably the most basic fact is that consciousness is fundamental. That's a fact of consciousness, and that the physical world is derived from consciousness. And, that became a fact just because things that I could do in consciousness could modify what happened in the physical reality, but it didn't work the other way. So the arrow of causality had to be from consciousness to the physical, not the other way around. So if consciousness was created by the physical, then the arrow would go the other way around. You could do things in the physical that would change consciousness, but it doesn't really work that way. You can do things in the physical that limit consciousness, that constrain consciousness, but it doesn't actually change it. It doesn't actually do anything to it. It just constrains what it can do with the avatar. So anyway, I had these consciousness facts. I had a bunch of facts about our physical universe that I had learned as a physicist. And now all I had to do was come up with some model, some set of ideas that let me answer all of those facts with just one overarching understanding. And I worked on that for those 35 years that I was trying to understand consciousness. And then I worked on it as I wrote the book as well, because when I wrote the book, I didn't really understand the science part of it as well as I do now. And it wasn't until the book had been out for a couple of years that I got some aha moments and realized that I understood quantum physics and relativity from, I could derive them from the fundamentals of consciousness. And then I started looking at all the other paradoxes in physics, and could I derive them? Could I solve them as well? And I could. So then the science part of it grew. So you'll find that when you read the My Big Toe book, it's mostly a model of consciousness. And it says that it is a big picture theory of everything, because I knew the physical had to fall out of it somehow, but I didn't know exactly, what the details of that were until a little later. So then in the last, 15 to 20 years, because it's been almost 20 years, not quite, but, I put it out in 2002, I think, was when it was first published, 2002, 2003, something like that. And now we're 2021, so we're getting on 20, 2 decades worth. So you'll notice that most of the science you'll find in YouTube, because it was after the book was written. And I did go back and change a couple paragraphs here and there in the book to add a little bit more of the science in now. So some of it's in the book that wasn't there in the very first edition, but not a lot. But then I didn't want the book to be too physicky. It's hard enough to read as it is, and making it more physics-like was not going to be helpful for most of my readers. So I just left that into YouTube. But basically, to answer your question, I just had to figure it out a little bit at a time. It's not, I didn't, it wasn't dictated to me by the LCS, it wasn't given to me in any way. I just had to figure it out from my own experience and then write it. And I found that the process of writing the books helped me understand a lot, because up until when you write it down, if you just have it conceptually in your head, everything seems perfectly clear until you have to explain it to somebody else. And then when you have to explain it to somebody else, you need more clarity, because you realize that some of your thoughts are kind of fuzzy. You sort of know what it is, but you aren't able to put it into concise language. That means you don't have it as a concise thought. If you have a concise thought, no problem with concise language. But we tend to think in fuzzy thoughts, because we sort of know what we mean, so we don't have to be too precise about it. And that doesn't work when you're writing a book. You have to actually write it down into decent English. So at that point of the writing, some of it became more clear than it had been. So it developed, partly the understanding developed as I wrote, some of it after. But it's all basically me trying to figure out how things work, which is that's what physicists do. They try to model reality. So it's just.
Thank you, Tom. In fact, the concern I have is that many people who are spiritual, usually it's through their heart rather than their logic. And when they talk about spiritual world and the world beyond and things which are beyond this material reality, they are usually made fun of by others. And maybe many people say, okay, you are stupid because, but maybe MBT is in fact filling this gap between spirituality and science. And before I get to know with MBT, I had the same problem. By my heart, I could feel something from maybe something beyond this reality, but I couldn't logically find something that explains that. And it made me confused. And when I've talked to some people who had scientific attitude, I felt that I'm a stupid person. But when I got to know with MBT, I couldn't find a scientific explanation of what I perceived by my heart and maybe from my inside. And really MBT saved me, and I should thank you for that. Really, it gave me a very good logic and understanding of reality, which provided some harmony between what I felt and what I thought. And but for maybe many people are like me who are confused between their between their logic and between their heart. So I wanted to ask you, if possible, could you please maybe write something, maybe provide another resource for people that maybe provides solid scientific evidence for people who are maybe who can't believe these spiritual concepts because they have a scientific attitude.
Okay. Well, I wrote the My Big Toe book to be an on-ramp for the science-minded people, for the left brain logical process people. So MBT does start at the beginning and slowly build up the logical case for love is the answer, which is basically a heart thing, right? When you get the love is the answer, well, now you've gotten to the heart. Those two things have to develop together, and it's not really a whole picture until you have them both. If you have just the heart part of it, then you think in terms of poetry, ideas that kind of have meaning to you, but you can't enunciate them clearly. You couldn't argue them or convince anybody else about them. They're just the way you feel about it. It's the way you think about it. So you're kind of stuck there. It's just a personal thing that's really impossible to share. And everybody is, comes to that place in their own way, in their own time, and everybody's place is a little different. But if you have the intellectual part, the physics part of it, then you have a logical process that takes you from the beginning all the way through to the end. But if all you do is understand it intellectually, then you've missed the point. You have to get it at a deeper level. I talk about the being level, which you might also say is the heart. You have to get it at a fundamental, intuitive being level. Otherwise, you don't have it. All you have is an intellectual picture of it. So it requires both of those to come together. And that's really what I'm hoping that MBT will do for people. It will allow the logical process people to find a path to their own understanding. But as they go, they need to take these ideas into them deeply, and it'll affect their heart. They have to see the world in a different way, not just learn the theory. So it's both. You're not really whole until you can understand both intuitively and intellectually what's going on and why it's going on that way. So that's really what MBT was about. And you'll notice if you've read the book that it's very much pitched toward the logical process kind of person. It's not pitched toward the heart person. They've got hundreds of books that they can go read that are in the religion and the metaphysics and philosophy. They've got lots of things they can read there. But mine is basically me speaking to another intellect, trying to show them this is a way, but the way has to run through the heart too. It can't just stay in the intellect. And if it does, it's of little importance. It's not going to help you grow up any if it all stuck in your intellect.
Yes, as you said, I believe most of the people are here or are in spiritual path have maybe they are here because of their being level. I mean, nobody will come towards MBT or maybe other spiritual paths through their intellect. Everyone comes through his being or her being. But the way MBT works is, I believe, the way it can be useful is from two aspects. First aspect is the aspect of solving the conflicting parts between being level and intellectual level. It makes harmony between them. For the seekers of the spiritual path, this is the first way it helps. The second way it helps it that because it uses science language, it helps these people to maybe protect themselves against the people who call them stupid people, because they can provide spiritual scientific evidence and scientific language to defend what they think which is true. I think these are the most useful parts of MBT. And I don't believe if somebody believes in spirituality, doesn't believe in spirituality on being level, will accept MBT even, because I mean, spiritual path is something which is related to being level. Mm-hmm. But as I said, these are two of my concerns which MBT can solve. And because you said maybe after writing your book, you found some equations, and I wanted to see, is there a way to have all these equations as a book or something, which as a booklet, something that can be gathered in one place, which if somebody has a question about MBT and maybe is attacking MBT, we can give the reference to that person. Okay, read that book. The equations are in there. That's my question and concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
So next up we have Jennifer.
Hi there. So I wanted to thank you again for inviting me to this because I hadn't been too active since July when my brother passed. So I really appreciate it. And actually, the last Imad's question was sort of made me think this, my question sort of fit into logic, sequential. Okay, so is there an actual home reality, like one place that we actually call home? Because if each time we transition into a new reality, death, birth, or dreams, and we forget as soon as we are in the new place, then how do we have any real concept of the true reality? Because what I keep hearing is true, that you realize that none of this is really important, or rather important in the sense that we humans think it is, then why make the connections with people and have our own personal dreams and memories in these lifetimes at all if it's to be forgotten? And what I can envision of this home place is we would be able to see our friends and families and lovers, and that we've had throughout all of our lifetimes if we were so inclined, because the memory of everything that we had done prior is always there in that one reality.
Okay.
Is that something that is actual?
Yeah. No, it doesn't really work like that, Jennifer. The only thing that's fundamental is consciousness itself. So consciousness is the fundamental thing. Everything else, all other realities in which you can have experience, I call those experiential realities. Okay, they're all virtual realities. Mm-hmm. So the continuity is in yourself. The continuity is your consciousness. Your consciousness is immortal. It goes on, it learns, it grows, it connects. And yes, the point of having those relationships, those connections that you have, say in this particular thing, is that they help you grow. They help you become, they help you evolve the quality of your consciousness. So that's the point of them. And when this one's over, then you have another one. And in that new experience packet, your relationships help you grow, help you make better choices, and so on. So the point of it is that it is accumulating within you. You're growing. All of those connections that you've made maybe thousands of times or many thousands of times, they're all part of who you are. And they all exist still in the databases, the historical databases. They're all there, in which case you can visit, you can interact, you can connect that way with the database. But each individual connection doesn't just go on. Its purpose is to help you evolve your quality. And some people find that really, really sad because they have these very, very strong connections here and they don't want to let them go. They want to keep them. It's just not a practical thing that can be accomplished. You would have, tens of thousands of husbands or wives, both husbands and wives, actually, and children and friends and best friends and so on. And it just isn't something that's doable to make some sort of base reality where we go off and do things, but we come back to the base reality.
Right.
It's not like that. We're all individuated units of consciousness, and we're all evolving and growing. And every lifetime, we get to make new friends, new relationships, new connections. And those connections are very valuable because it's through those relationships that we grow. So those things are very, very important to us. And if we love well and love often and love many, then we will grow up the most. So yes, when those relationships are all very dear to us and mean a lot to us, that's when we grow a lot. Those relationships that don't really matter so much are usually not ones that really, are involved in our growth. So we need those close relationships. They're very important. And they're important not only for you, but they're important for the person you're having the relationship with, because they're also an individuated unit of consciousness. And because of you, they're growing. Because of them, you're growing. You see? So everybody is growing up through the interactions. And then everybody goes back for more interactions. And everybody's growing up through the interactions. So that's the way the system works. And I know some people find that a problem or upsetting because they don't want to let go of what they have now. But the letting go is not really a problem, because all the people that you care about, they're also growing from the stimulus they get from you. They're going to go on and take what you help them learn and learn more next time. And you're going to take what they help you learn and learn more next time.
Yeah. But I mean, I think, I understand that. But the people that can remember their past lives, for example, I mean, that sort of is the idea I was thinking of, that you can sort of connect to your past, but not everyone can do that unless they've grown up enough, I guess, to see it.
Yeah. Well,
so I guess that's the idea I sort of thought about.
Yeah, that's always available. And you can do that, way back. Doesn't have to be just the last couple. You can go back for just as long as you like, and you can connect to the experiences you've had, and the interactions that you had. And that's all available in the database. You just have to develop your intuitive side enough that you can access that data. It is available, but the more you grow up, the more available it is.
Yeah, because I thought, do you have to redevelop your intuition every single incarnation, or do you sort of, it's easier each time?
It's easier each time.
Okay,
you always
that's good news.
You always start the next one where you left off for the last one. Now you have to reacquire it through good choices, but you already have a proclivity toward making those good choices because you're already more grown up. So the choices that you make are more likely to be, low entropy choices, just because that's the way you are. You're a more low entropy kind of person, but you still have to start from, being born, and learning language and doing this. It's just that you'll get there a lot faster.
Yeah.
By the time you're to midlife, you will have already pulled it all back in and will be cutting new ground now, digging in new ground. But you do have to get it back, but it comes quickly.
Yeah, it feels like it's familiar, the way it feels coming back, like I've done this before. Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, great question, Jennifer. Thank you. Over to you, Victor.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here today. So I happen to be a researcher who spends most of the time doing science, and I was wondering, what can I do as a researcher for MBT? So my question for Tom is, do you have any research ideas related to MBT in the area of computer science, like gathering evidence about something or just computing things, taking data?
Well,
if you have any ideas, could you please share?
yes, sure. In computing science, yes, the idea that we started off talking about, the very first question, which was about conscious computers. I think that would be a
Yes.
really interesting thing to do. And the way to do that would be to create, you could learn everything that Google has written down, because they've published papers about their AlphaZero neural net and how they did that, basically. So you can learn from the people who've already, are on that trail. But I'm thinking of a matrix of neural nets, not just a neural net, but multiple neural nets, maybe a dozen, maybe more. Very much patterned after the way the brain works. Your brain works by having subsets of it that do certain functions, and they do that well. There's the cell, there's this, the part that does the fight or flight, and that's kind of an old part of the brain. And, it's attached to the adrenaline, whether you speed that up. There's that part of the brain that does that. That's the part that does our thinking up here in the forehead. There's the part that's sight, the part that's sound. And we look at all the various kind of functions we have, kind of the fundamental ways we process data. And generally there's a piece of us that processes that in a different part of this virtual brain that we have. So I'd take that virtual brain and try to model a set of neural networks, each one somewhat specialized, but all of them working together. There's a lot of cross connects too. That, if this part of the brain does something, it triggers something else in some other part, which does something else. And the whole thing has hierarchy, which ones override which ones. And, it's a little complex, but that is actually good. And if you had something like that and you could put it together, then you would have to find task for it, a job for it to do that had meaningful choices for it to make. And if you had that, I think that a consciousness would probably log onto it to use it as as an avatar. Why not? If it had good choices, interesting choices. So that would be those are the key things. If you can get that together, then I think we would see a consciousness. And again, the problem would be, how do you prove that this thing is conscious? Well, just by its behavior, what it does and how it does it. The Turing test is really not that hard to pass. The Turing test just says that if another, in conversation with another human, that human can't tell whether it's, can't tell that it's a computer. In other words, if it acts and sounds and behaves like a human, then it passes the Turing test. Well, that Turing test could be maybe a little more strict, but you would have to see that it had judgment. It had understanding of itself. It knew that it was an entity and that it understood these things. It had self-awareness. That would be a thing to do. Now you can do an expert system that would pretend to have self-awareness, but this would be real self-awareness. And you'd need to have some kind of teach it a language. I suspect if you can teach it to play chess, you ought to teach it to be able to do syntax, and vocabulary. That seems to me is in a simple measure of language is not as complex as chess. But in any case, yes, that would, I think, be a real fun thing to do, is to work on conscious computers. And no doubt Google, in their, I think it's called DeepMind, is their division or group of people that works, in this area. Those are the people that have come up with the AlphaZero, chess neural net. So they're working on things like that, I suspect, but I don't know whether they have the big picture or not. Probably not. They're probably going at it just from a scientific viewpoint and a trial and error viewpoint. Well, let's do this and see what happens. I suspect they're kind of in that mode, but they don't really have a framework for an understanding of what they should put together to get something that would be conscious. So that would be something that you might add to that, or you could take their work and then build on it.
I see. So I have one question about this. So you said that we could combine multiple neural networks and somehow have relationships between them. Now, my question is, how is that different from having a single huge neural network? And then we somehow, deep learning basically works by trying to learn the patterns itself without, much guidance about it.
Right.
So we could kind of have a very, very big neural network and just let it kind of specialize certain parts of itself without us forcing the system to do it our way.
Yeah,
do you
absolutely.
think that would make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's basically the same thing as what I was describing, whether you actually do it in several pieces or whether you just specialize subsets of a larger piece is not, I don't know, that's all basically the same thing. It just depends on how you do it. When I was talking about doing it with separate neural nets, I was going to let the systems also develop those separate neural nets, how they were going to best interact with each other. I wasn't going to give that hard code. I was going to let them interact with each other in the way that best enabled them to solve the problems they have to solve. So in that case, it really doesn't matter which way you go. If you start with pieces, they would all end up being one thing, all interacting together. Or if you start off with one thing that has certain specialties, it's going to be the same thing either way. So I don't think that matters as to how you do that configuration. And you'd also have to have, it's not as, I make it sound very simple. It's not going to be that simple. You're going to have a certain amount of randomness in it too. You may have some kind of a function that says that when it comes to, choices where there is less than delta V, where V is some variable that it uses to decide, whether it's going to do this or that. So if you have several choices where the choice is less than a delta V separated from the other choices, well, now maybe you just have some randomness thrown into that. Say, well, okay, then we're just going to choose this one randomly out of those 4 choices that are all very similar. We'll just choose this one, or we'll boost this one up and not that one, and let that be random, because there needs to be a few random processes also embedded in that. It can't all just be focused. Some parts, randomness is going to be important. And I think it's probably important when we have choices that aren't obvious, when we have choices that it could be this way, that way, or the other way, and we really don't have a strong reason to pick between them, then the system needs to randomly pick one and see how that does it. Okay, if you pick this one, how does that make the whole? Does that make the whole work better or worse? And then let it readjust itself again because of that input. So randomness has to be a part of the thing, and exactly how to apply that randomness and what quantity, there's going to be a great deal of trial and error in that process.
Yes, and I think it's kind of difficult to, so these learning networks usually require some sort of reward function, at least the reinforcement learning ones that I know of. They learn by making choices and somehow getting feedback about that choice in each step. But that means that basically, if we want to build a system like that, then we have to somehow either define whether a choice is good or not, or we somehow have to have external, like somehow give feedback to the system.
Right.
And that might, yes.
And that will be the process that will make it slower. Now, when they did AlphaZero, they had very, very fast computer, big supercomputer that Google has. So they set up this neural network, and then the neural network played like 50 million games of chess in the next 20 seconds. So it can play a game of chess in a nanosecond. Well, now you can do millions of games per second. So it learns fast that way. Well, if you're teaching it to do other things with more meaningful choices, it's going to be a little slower probably in how you're going to make those judgments and what is right and what's wrong. Yeah, it has to learn. So it's going to have to start from knowing nothing and over time gain information about how it's doing. And that's going to be part of it. Is it making good choices? Is it making low entropy choices? And how does it determine a low entropy choice from a higher entropy choice?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's part of it. And that's not going to be so quick, because in the world of meaningful, ethical, moral choices, it's hard to set up a situation where you make millions of them per second. Well, maybe if you could have it interacting with a social system of its own type, have one of them. That's how they had the chess played against itself, basically. So you have two of them and they all play chess together. Well, you'd have to have a social system. You'd have to have 20 or 30 of them all interacting with each other. And those interactions would have to be set up that they had ethical and moral choices and values of, were they being cooperative or were they being self-centered? And you see, what's a low entropy and a high entropy choice would have to be defined for them. And then they could learn a certain amount, and then maybe you could let them loose among humans and let that refine further. But it's not a simple thing to do, but yeah, it is doable.
That's basically my follow-up question is, could this be a closed system? Or does it have to interact with humanity in very large scale ways? Well,
it depends on what you want it to do. It could be a closed system if you had a very well-defined set of tasks you wanted it to do. You could limit it to just those tasks. But if you want it to be more like a human consciousness, then you would have to give it choices like a human has. So it just depends on the product you were looking for.
I see.
Okay, great. Great question.
Thank you, Tom.